Okay, what we want to talk about today is elasticity and its application. Elasticity and its application is the subject of Chapter 5. And I started this with you in class this week, but I made some changes and there are some other things I want to point out. So we're going to start elasticity and its application from the beginning. This will be the basis for your quiz next Tuesday. And the quiz will basically be on Chapter 5, Elasticity and its application. In addition to that, on Tuesday, I'm going to give you a tutorial or a presentation on um, Social Security. It's not a long one. It's just not involved. It's something you guys need to know about. And so your test will include Chapter 5 plus what I cover on Tuesday on Social Security. Okay, so you saw this before. We're trying to simplify a complex subject, which is sometimes hard for students to grasp, and that is, what is elasticity? Okay, and simply said, economists use this to measure movement along the demand curve. And they use it because they want to know what's going to happen with a given price change. In other words, if the price changes, what will happen to the quantity demanded in the case of the demand curve, right? So it's called and referred to as the elasticity of demand in economics. So definition is a measure of how much the quantity demanded of a good responds to a change in the price of the good. In other words, the responsiveness of a change in quantity to the change in price. Now, one of the key elements of this is we're trying to use this to predict what's going to happen if we raise prices. It's used in industry, it's used by government to try to determine what's going to happen with a given price increase and how will the public react to that price increase. And this goes back to the example I gave you about chocolate chip cookies. Here we go again. Price of the box of chocolate chip cookies was $2, but the vendor, the company, whoever, raised it to $2.50. So what we're measuring is what's going to happen to a price increase or decrease for a product in the marketplace. So a good can be either elastic or inelastic. If it's elastic, it means that the change in the price occurred in a significant manner. In other words, the quantity demanded increased. Elasticity is measured by, if it's more than one, it's elastic. And then in the case of inelastic, if the change in price does not result in a noticeable change in quantity demanded, then it's referred to as inelastic, and an inelastic demand curve is less than 1. So think about it in terms of the measurement itself. If there's a big price change and a big movement in quantity along with that price change, that's elastic. If there's a movement in price, but not a significant movement in the quantity demanded, that's inelastic. So let's talk about that in class. If you guys have any trouble with that concept, let me know and we'll go back through it again in class. All right, we did this as well. Elements that affect change or elasticity. Number 1, the availability of close substitutes. We're going to talk in a little while about the impact of substitutes on electricity, on elasticity. And we will show you how to calculate elasticity of complementary or substitutable products. So the example we always use is beef for chicken. The price of beef goes up very high and the quantity purchased of chicken starts to increase dramatically. Okay? We can measure that elasticity. And I will show you how later on. Is it a luxury or a necessity? Well, a car is a necessity. But for instance, think about the value or the price that has to be paid for the car. A Mercedes at $100,000, if the Mercedes company raises the price $2,000, The people that spend $100,000 for a Mercedes, it's not going to have a big impact on their demand curve. But in the case of Ford, let's take a Ford Fusion, the low end of the Ford family. If, for instance, that price was raised $2,000, that would have a significant impact. For instance, the car is probably selling for somewhere around $25,000. $2,000 is a big increase for that type of car. Whereas in the case of Mercedes, it doesn't have that much of an impact. So, given our example, in the case of the Mercedes, the demand curve is inelastic with a $2,000 price increase. In the case of the Ford, a $2,000 price increase means the curve is elastic. Or, excuse me, yeah, very elastic. All right, the other thing that impacts it is the size of the market. We talked about competitive markets. The competitive market has many sellers and many buyers. Therefore, the market itself tends to be very inelastic or narrow. In other words, a broad market means that you can buy the product from any number of vendors. So a broad market tends to be more inelastic than a narrow market. The amount of time being measured. Impact of high gasoline prices, purchasing habits of buyers of small cars over large cars. Now, if we look at the price of gasoline in the short run, if the price goes up, it's not going to have a big impact on the purchases of gasoline because we have to purchase gasoline to get to work. So it doesn't really get affected by price changes that much. However, over the long run, what occurs if gasoline prices stay up there too high? Buyers of cars will shift from larger cars and pickups to smaller cars. That phenomenon happened during the 70s, during the gas crisis. It also happened during the 80s. And it's shifted the other way recently in the last 2, 3, 4 years with a drop in the price of gasoline. People are shifting more and more into larger cars, SUVs and pickups. We can see that a lot in the Texas area. Okay, so here's our demand curve that we've been using throughout our examples. $30 if you want for a price, 5 units. The price drops to 7, we pick up five more units. Now I skipped through this, but I'm going to spend time on this. All right, so top of the curve, let's assume that the price increases from $25 to $30. The quantity demanded drops from 7 to 5 units. That's almost a 3/4 impact, or 75%. Another way of looking at this. Toward the bottom of the curve, price increases about $5 to $10, then the quantity drops from 30 to 20, or 2/3 impact. So at the upper end of the demand curve, we are elastic, more elastic, and the impact on quantity is significant. On the lower end, it is not as significant in our chart. So at different points, the demand curve can be elastic, and the elasticity can vary at different points, which creates some confusion in many cases for economists. So as a result of that, economists prefer to look at a demand curve and find the midpoint on that curve. In other words, where are all the prices and quantities above that point, and where are all the prices and quantities below that point? By selecting the midpoint, they can more accurately describe or predict what the elasticity is going up the curve or down the curve, okay? Because they know at that midpoint, we have what we call unitary elasticity, which means elasticity equals 1. Above that point, elasticity is more than 1. Below that point, elasticity is less than 1. All right, elasticity along the demand curve. Here's the curve that I showed you in class. Elasticity at the midpoint is equal to 1. On the upper end, elasticity is more than 1, so it's elastic. That is elastic demand. If you look all the way up at the top, you'll see a price of 50 cents, $50, whatever the case may be. Elasticity is infinite. In other words, it goes on forever. Right? If you look at the curve below unitary elasticity, or where the elasticity is 1 or equal to 1, that section of the curve is inelastic. And you drop all the way down to the quantity of 20, and you'll find that elasticity is equal to 0. In other words, 0 inelasticity. Inelastic demand is equal to 0, so it's inelastic demand, right? When it equals 0, it's inelastic. Doesn't say that in the chart, but that's how you interpret that. Okay, demand curve elasticity. Let's take a look at it. There are many different versions of elasticity and many different shapes of curves. This is kind of an example of what it will always look like. Elasticity of demand, perfectly elastic, is a flat line, horizontal. And that flat line is similar to a very competitive market where lots of buyers and lots of sellers. The next chart over shows relatively elastic. That's our typical demand curve, straight line sloping downward and to the right. Unitary elasticity is where it's elastic all the way along the curve. The inelastic part is negligible. And relatively inelastic is almost a vertical, and completely inelastic is a vertical curve. Okay, so that's what the elasticity measure tells us in these demand functions. In the case of perfectly elastic, as I said, we've got a situation where there are many, many buyers and many sellers. Right? Perfectly inelastic means that it doesn't matter what the price is, that's the quantity that's going to be sold and or produced. Remember that, okay? Be sure you understand the difference between the vertical and the horizontal curves for the demand curve inelasticity. All right, so in your course and in your text and in your tests, I'm not going to have you calculate price elasticity. It's more important to me that you understand the concepts than know how to do the math. Okay? This is not a math course, it's an economics course, and I'm really concerned and I want to be sure that you guys understand the concepts behind what we're talking about in economics. That understanding is more important than being able to do the computation, in my opinion. Okay, so when an economist wants to measure elasticity, he's got a couple of options. Let's take a look at them. Number one, he can take and divide the percentage change in the quantity demanded by the percentage change in price at any point on the demand curve, which is kind of what we did in our example of the demand curve that we have. So on the previous chart, the one that I just showed you, if it's elastic, if the demand is elastic, if the elasticity number is greater than 1. It's inelastic if it's less than 1. That means a discount or reduction in price doesn't have the same smack or effect that it does at different points in the curve, or a discount or an increase in price. So it kind of tells you where you should be on the curve if you're running a business. All right, change in elasticity. Economists prefer to use the midpoint on the curve to calculate elasticity. And the reason is it's easy to find that point. And going up the curve, you can get a measure of elasticity quickly. And going down the curve, you can get a measure of inelasticity quickly. So by taking the midpoint, they can quickly determine the elasticity part and the inelasticity part and actually calculate the number. Okay, this is a significant advantage to economists. So what they might do is take all the points on the curve, add them up, and divide by the number of products in there. They also would probably, a more accurate method would be to take the median, okay, and make their calculations from that point, the median being the midpoint on the curve. All right, in both cases, the answer is the same. The preferred method, which is the midpoint of the curve, is preferred because it makes the calculation that much easier, more accurate, and you're not confused by where you might be on the demand curve. You know exactly where you are. So that's why they kind of look at that as the preferred method of calculating elasticity. All right, just kind of gave you the answer. We look at the chart. Elasticity above that midpoint, or the unitary elastic or perfectly elastic, is the point at which they start their calculations. They can move up the chart and make the calculation, or they can move down the chart to make down the curve to make the calculation. The resulting answers from the calculation, if it's less than 1, you are in the inelastic. That's a typo error. Calculation result, the number that is less than 1, you are in the inelastic portion, not the elastic portion. I'll fix that. Greater than 1, of course, is elastic. As I said, I got one piece right anyway. The point above the midpoint is elastic. The point below it is inelastic. And I will correct that chart. So above the midpoint tends to be elastic. Below the midpoint tends to be inelastic, in spite of what this chart says on the second bullet. So I'll get that fixed for you. So the thing for you guys to remember is that the top part of the demand curve is elastic. The bottom part is inelastic. Greater than 1 is elastic. Less than 1 is inelastic. All right, elasticity along demand curve continued. Here's our chart again. This describes exactly what we were talking about. Pick the midpoint. Elasticity is equal to 1. Move up the curve, and you'll see that it is elastic demand. And at the top, as we mentioned, it's infinite. Go below the elasticity point of 1, and you'll see the demand is totally inelastic. Okay? And when it's on the line or on the axis of quantity, and it's equal to, then elasticity is equal to 0. All right, now let's relate this to the operations of a firm. Now, businesses have to be aware, consciously or unconsciously, about what happens to their revenue if, for instance, they move their price up or down. Okay? And they use elasticity of their demand to try to determine what point they should be at. So, a producer's total revenue is the sum of all sales in a given period. So, revenue for a producer or a firm is the sum of all sales, right? We derive that revenue by multiplying the total units sold by the prices they were sold at, and that gives us our total revenue for the company or for the producer. This is key because this tells him this is his starting point to determine whether he's going to make a profit or not. Okay? Therefore, an inelastic demand price and total revenue will move in the same direction. With elastic demand, price increases and revenue decreases. Unitary elasticity equal to 1, total revenue remains constant at price changes. So where we want to be if we're a corporation, okay? For instance, the first example, inelastic demand, the price and total revenue move in the same direction, right? With elastic demand, price increases, revenue decreases. Unitary elasticity is where the firm wants to be. No matter what he does to prices, he still makes the same amount of money. So the elastic demand price increases and revenue decreases. That makes sense because what we do is we move up the demand curve. And as we move up the demand curve at higher and higher prices, we cannot sell as much as we did before. Right? In elastic demand price, we can sell more and it moves in the same direction with revenue. But at that point, the producer has to look at his costs and make sure that that production level that he's doing is not impacting him through the law of diminishing returns. which we talked about earlier. So the sweet spot for all producers is unitary elasticity, or we elasticity equals 1. So total revenue remains constant with a given price change. So take a look at that, think about it. I think it makes pretty much common sense that, particularly when you think about an increase in price, just draw your curves of demand and supply and look what happens if you increase the price and the supply curve doesn't shift. All right, elasticity, demand, and revenue all taken together. This is what a firm strives for. He wants to be at the point of unit elasticity, where it's equal to 1. The top part chart shows his demand curve, okay, which we've been looking at. Unit elasticity is calculated as the midpoint there. It's where it's equal to 1. And you will notice that his total revenue curve follows that line as well. So for a company, they must be at the apex or the high point of their revenue curve, and they must therefore be unitary elastic, and therefore they can be profitable. Prior to that point, okay, they're starting to make more and more revenue, right? But when they reach that point, they're at the max or apex, and beyond that point, revenue will start to decline. And that's where you have to be very careful about what you're doing in terms of your costs. We've already talked about costs. If a firm is efficient at 100,000 units and he wants to produce 10,000 more, take a chance in the marketplace. If he takes that chance, he will find out that the unit cost of that additional 10,000 units is higher than the unit cost of all 100,000 he was producing before that. And that's the law of diminishing returns. And suppliers, producers have to be very careful of how they do that. It's easy to spend your way into bankruptcy. Okay, income inelasticity is the concept in your book. By the way, speaking of the book, let me just get it out here. You probably can't see it, but on page, looks like 97, figure 4 shows how you calculate elasticity. And be sure you understand how that is done. In the example that they give, the sweet spot is between $4 and $5 price, a quantity of 6 and 8. So look at that chart, because that chart shows you how they calculate elasticity and how important elasticity is to the firm. All right. Okay, demand for products is a big function of our income. We've talked about this a lot. The more we feel about, the better we feel about our income, the more solid our income is, the more we continue to make money. The outlook for our business or our job looks pretty satisfactory. We will take chances and we will make purchasing decisions based on the fact that we can recover if we've made the wrong decision. For instance, buy a more expensive car than a less expensive car. We're feeling good, we might take the risk. We might be willing to borrow a little bit more money than we probably would have normally, because we're looking pretty good. Income stream is pretty good, and our purchasing decisions may be a little bit on the high side because of it. Okay, therefore, if our income is rising and we feel really, really good about it, we will tend to spend more on consumer goods and on higher end items. So we not only will improve or increase our quantity purchases, but we will also be able to look at purchasing higher end, more expensive items, more expensive stores, brand names, stuff that people show off at cocktail parties. Now, be careful, because the reverse is also true. You have to be prepared in your life. If you have a significant reduction in income or loss as a result of, say, a recession, you've got to be able to quickly adjust your own spending habits. Don't continue down the same old path you were on before. it will spell disaster. You'll probably end up deeper and deeper in debt, and that's the last thing you want to do. So be careful and be sure you're always willing to pull back to what is a comfortable level of income that you are able to keep and spend. Okay, elasticity of income, therefore, is achieved by dividing the percentage change in the quantity demanded by the percentage change in income. So what we're doing here is we're saying if we get an increase in income, we can look at that and determine what it's going to do in terms of the quantity demanded. Kind of a significant calculation. Again, you don't have to do the calculation, but that is how it's done. So we want to look at the change in income versus, as a result of a change in income, what happened to the quantity demanded. And when we say a change in income, we're looking like we did above on higher income and or lower income. What is the impact? That's what we want to know. Another thing that affects the elasticity of a product is cross-elasticity of demand. Now, this is simply comparing two products that are in the marketplace that we have the option or the choice to buy. So let's look at that. Consumer preferences, substitution effect, complementary goods are all things that we talked about before. Consumer preferences, for instance, I prefer steak over chicken, but if the steak price gets too high, I'll buy more chicken. Matter of fact, that's happening today. The production and the demand for chicken is going through the roof. The other element is a substitution effect. Again, beef and chicken. The price of beef goes up too high. I don't like it, so I buy chicken. I cook chicken at home, chicken in the pot. And then complementary goods affect the demand for products. We talked about the golf course. Golf course prices going through the roof. The demand for golf clubs will decline in proportion. All right, so the cross elasticity of demand is a change in the quantity demanded of one divided by the percentage change in the price of another. So in this case, if we're buying more chicken, the quantity demanded of chicken divided by the percentage change in price of steak enables us to measure the cross elasticity of demand. Okay? Think about that. Don't let it throw you. It's a simple concept. What does the price change of one product have on the demand for another product? In the case we just used, steak, high price, more chicken is purchased. So we can measure the elasticity of those two products. So, in other words, how is the demand for chicken affect an increase in the price of chicken? Okay. What will happen if we substitute chicken for steak? As we said, chicken prices will increase, steak prices will decrease, and eventually they'll come back to an equilibrium price for both of them. Okay, so elasticity of supply, last piece. Pretty much the same as demand. We want to know how responsive the suppliers are to a change in the price of for their product. And that's what we use elasticity of supply for. So let's look at it. How quickly do producers respond to a change in price with a change in the quantity supply? So it's just looking at, instead of the demand curve, in this case, we're looking at the supply curve. How quickly can they respond to a change in price with an increase or a change in quantity? So same observations that we made on demand can also be made in terms of supply. It may depend. Now, if you look at the supply curve, we have much the same thing. Again, the supply curve is a direct relationship between price and quantity. Demand curve, of course, is an inverse relationship. But in terms of elasticity, we measure it much the same way, and the conclusions pretty much can be determined in the same methods that we used in the demand curve, in the elasticity of demand. So how do we calculate elasticity of supply? Essentially the same methods used to calculate the elasticity of supply as demand. Okay? No mystery to that. So we measure elasticity of supply by dividing the percentage change in the quantity supplied by the percentage change in the price. Again, this is percentage change based in unit prices. Okay? So what it says is that we essentially do the same thing we did with demand. We're dividing percentage changes, and the change in quantity is divided by the change in the price. So, same results. If the result is greater than 1, supply is elastic. Less than 1, it's inelastic. I guess in that one I got it right. Simple to do. Supply is not much different than demand. The concept is essentially the same. We're unitary elastic at 1, and that's where we should be. If we're above that, we're elastic, and price changes will cause big changes in supply. If we're below that, price changes will have a less significant increase in supply. Well, there's a supply curve. You can kind of do the same calculations we did before. At $10, we're going to buy probably 17. At $15, $5 more, we're probably going to almost double that. So supply elasticity. Here's what it looks like. Perfectly elastic is the same as a demand curve. It runs horizontal from one axis to the other. So it's a horizontal curve to be perfectly elastic. Perfectly inelastic is an upright curve, right? It's vertical, okay? And that means that it doesn't matter what the price is, the quantity purchased is going to be exactly the same. Right? Move that price up and down that curve till hell freezes over. But basically, the quantity demanded is always inelastic, and it is the same quantity, does not change. And that's the same thing we said about demand curve. It was inelastic when it is vertical and elastic when it's horizontal. Okay, we're going to quit there. Again, your quiz on Tuesday will be on Chapter 5. Plus, on Tuesday, I'm going to give you a tutorial on Social Security. That will also be part of your quiz. So be sure you take a look at this and have a good weekend.